Parliament has approved Singapore's $143 billion budget following a three-day debate which saw more than 50 MPs speak on pressing issues like the cost of living, family support and AI disruption. Addressing the concerns raised, Prime Minister Lawrence Wong says thriving in uncertainty is never easy, but he says the country has strong foundations that give it confidence to move forward from a strong fiscal footing to a clear plan for the road ahead.
This year's budget paves the way for us to chart Singapore's next leg, to navigate uncertainties with gumption and strength, to address immediate challenges decisively, and to secure our long-term future with confidence. It is a budget put together by Singaporeans, with Singaporeans, for all Singaporeans. So let us write the next chapter of our Singapore story and move onward together for a better tomorrow.
The Prime Minister is also urging companies to put in effort to transform and keep pace with competition, even as the government continues to support them and their workers. He says this is how Singapore will navigate an uncertain global environment and continue to create good jobs and opportunities for its people. Sabrina reports.
With protectionist sentiments growing globally, Prime Minister Lawrence Wong says this spells bad news for small, open economies like Singapore. The competition for investments is also heating up as nations beef up their own manufacturing output. With Singapore's productivity growing at 2% per annum over the past decade, Mr. Wong says there's a continued push to improve this.
Constant innovation and transformation can allow businesses to stay competitive and relevant. It's not easy to make such transformations, but for firms that are willing to do so, the government will provide our full support.
Mr. Wong cited baking supplier Poon Huat as an example of a firm that had adapted its business model through an e-commerce platform and refreshed retail space. While he hopes more businesses will tap on existing schemes to make similar moves, not many have taken up such opportunities.
We've been discussing with the TACs to find out why, so that we can raise awareness amongst the SMEs and also do what we can to make the schemes more accessible. We hope the latest budget moves will help. And if the utilization of these schemes turns out to be higher than expected and more funding is required, I assure you the Ministry of Finance will be happy to provide additional resources.
Mr. Wong also touched on jobs, more specifically, the anxiety workers may feel as industries transform and jobs get redesigned. He urged them to look at the underlying reasons for this and to avoid simply blaming the foreign. This has led to negative and xenophobic public discourse in other countries.
That's not what we stand for in Singapore, and we must never allow that to happen here. Our approach towards foreign workers is clear. We welcome them to work here, but we do this in a controlled manner and ensure that they complement Singaporeans. And we have continued to fine-tune over time our system of controls.
Aside from changes to foreign employment policies and protecting locals against discrimination, the government is also doubling down on the adult education and training system to equip people with skills for the future economy.
We are fully committed to this endeavour, and I expect to put in additional resources in the coming years to further strengthen Skills Future. So, we cannot save every job, but we will support every worker in Singapore. We will create even more opportunities and better jobs for all Singaporeans.
PM Wong says the government will do whatever is necessary to support every Singaporean at every life stage. More will also come in future installments of Forward SG. Now, he says a sustainable way to tackle cost of living pressures is by making sure that Singaporeans have higher real incomes. Rebecca Metteo with more.
In its budget wrap-up speech, Mr. Wong was clear from the get-go that wars, supply chain disruptions and rising energy costs were to blame for rising prices. The impact of GST hike on inflation, he said, was merely transitory and that inflation will eventually moderate. In 2022, inflation stood at 6.1% and after two phases of the GST hike to 9%, inflation moderated to 2.4% in 2024. He put these stats to Leader of the opposition, Pritam Singh, who had earlier said that the GST increase turbocharged inflation.
Where is the turbocharging? Look, I know elections are approaching, but this chamber is not an election rally. Let's not get carried away by hyperbole and have a debate based on facts. The fact is inflation has eased, both globally and in Singapore. But people are still concerned about cost pressures. It's not unique to us.
Mr. Wong acknowledged that it will take time for people to adjust to new price realities. That's why measures like the CDC voucher scheme are meant to offset cost pressures. He pledged to continue providing support for as long as it is needed and as long as it's within the country's means.
The Workers' Party and the Progress Singapore Party appear to be unhappy and displeased that the government is providing vouchers to help Singaporeans with the cost of living. They suggest that the government is relying solely on vouchers to help with the cost of living, but we've never said that. These are temporary help measures. They are not long-term solutions. In fact, they only make up a small part of our overall budget. The cost of living measures and the SG60 package account for about 5% of our budget.
The vast majority of spending in this year's budget goes towards more structural programs. The aim here, Mr. Wong said, is to tackle cost of living by increasing real incomes. According to charts he produced in the House, Singapore has fared well compared to other advanced economies. Real household incomes for the broad middle base, for instance, have risen by 3.1%, faster than in other developed economies. Even so, Mr. Wong said the government will do more.
We want to provide greater assurance to Singaporeans across every life stage on their basic needs like education, retirement, healthcare, and housing. We want to provide more support for the disadvantaged and vulnerable groups. We want to ensure that no one is left to fend for themselves in Singapore. And if anyone faces setbacks, we have a system in place to help them recover and bounce back stronger.
As an example of such assurances, Mr. Wong described past moves to make public housing more affordable. These have included a combination of subsidies, cooling measures, and a ramp-up supply of new flats.
For now, we have focused on ensuring that the new flats are available for first-timers, especially young married couples and parents with young children. And we are already seeing concrete improvements. Application rates are now below pre-COVID levels. And with a sustained and robust supply of new flats, and as the overall market stabilizes, we will have scope to consider how to adjust our policies to meet the needs of other groups, including second-timers and singles.
Mr. Wong took pains to assure Singaporeans that the government is committed to doing all that's necessary to support them at every life stage. But in a nod to the Forward Singapore movement that has been his signature, he also urged individuals and the community to share in the responsibility.
Touching on governance, Prime Minister Wong says it is about responsibility and not just about making popular decisions. Responding to questions on GST hikes and fiscal marksmanship, he says the move was made to fund the country's growing and future needs. Rebecca Metteo with this report.
The move to raise revenues had been a long time coming, according to Mr. Wong. The country's long-term needs for healthcare and an aging population had been obvious for some time. So even when the COVID-19 pandemic hit and with no end in sight, the government knew it had to follow through.
We looked at different ways to raise revenues, including through property and income taxes, but these moves were still not enough to cover the expected increase in expenditure, which was sure to happen. So what should we do to plug the funding gap? That's why we had to consider the GST increase. It was a difficult decision. It was a difficult choice. It's never easy to raise taxes, and certainly not a tax like the GST. But governance is about making responsible choices, not just popular ones.
Mr. Wong said that if it hadn't been for revenue from the increase in GST and an unexpected upside in corporate income tax collections, Singapore would have ended the fiscal year 2024 and probably 2025 in deficit, and that would have meant less support for essential services, seniors and even the country's future. Mr. Wong also responded to questions on whether Singapore was being overly conservative in its fiscal projections.
It's not just a matter of good marksmanship or poor marksmanship. It's a question of the right values and the wrong values, the correct fiscal principles and the wrong fiscal principles. And the WP and the PSP may think that we are being overly cautious in our projections, but this government will never take risk with Singaporeans' lives and future. We keep our public finances healthy year after year. We spend within our means, and if there are new or additional areas of need, we raise revenues to meet these new demands.
Mr. Wong believes Singapore's fiscal system has helped achieve equitable outcomes that are progressive and fair. This has also been endorsed by the OECD.
Singaporeans will decide. Will they prefer a government that underestimates our needs, spends more from our hard-earned reserves and leaves us weaker? Or will Singaporeans prefer a government that steadfastly upholds fiscal responsibility and discipline and ensures we have enough resources for current and future generations to handle unexpected challenges? Sir, the PAP's approach is clear. We take our duty as stewards of the country seriously. We remain true to our mission and manage our finances carefully for the benefit of all Singaporeans now and in the future. We will continue to do our best to convince Singaporeans that ours is the right approach.
Cost of living dominating the debate, with Leader of the Opposition, Pritam Singh, explaining what he meant when he said the GST hike had led to a turbocharging of inflation.
Prime Minister asks about where is the turbocharging on the matter of inflation. I took reference from the reply that was given by the government in early 2024. I think it was referred to by Member Saktiandi as well, where the MAS set out a projected number with regard to core inflation for 2024. It was 2.5 to 3.5%. And it assessed, or it estimated, that the goods and services tax rate increase would contribute slightly less than 1% to core inflation. So if you take that figure with the lower end of the estimate at 2.5%, that's 40%. And that is the contribution of the GST hike. That's how I read it, hence the term, hence my characterization of turbocharged.
I think he would have also, if he had read the reply he cited, read other MAS statements, which stated very clearly the impact of the GST on price levels is once-off, and it is transitory. The impact of inflation is transitory. And the explanation he gave that the impact of GST on inflation, the once-off effect or the transitory effect, is high as a proportion of the base inflation actually doesn't make sense, because if I take that view, then I really should be raising GST at a time of very high inflation. Then the proportionate impact would be quite small, because the 1% on a very high inflation base means that there is very little impact. But if that's the case that the Workers' Party feels, then really there should not be any concern about the timing of the GST increase.
Non-constituency MPs Hazel Phua and Leong Man Wai pressed the Prime Minister on the government's fiscal position and whether more can be spent to help Singaporeans cope with the high cost of living. Mr. Leong saying he believes a budget surplus resulting from overtaxation and overcharging is driving structural inflation in Singapore.
PSP is not displeased with the vouchers because we believe that they will help Singaporeans in the short term, but not over the long term. Now, the Prime Minister has said that he has concrete plans for the future. So can I ask if his plans include plans to lower our high cost of living with measures that have longer term effects rather than vouchers?
The bulk of our government spending is directed towards these structural longer-term programs in ensuring that economy is strong so that Singaporeans earn higher incomes. Those are the things we are doing. Let's try not to put a wedge between the government and the people. There is no point saying the government is rich and has strong fiscal position and then painting this as being detrimental to the well-being of Singaporeans. A strong fiscal position for Singapore is not at the expense of Singaporeans. In fact, it benefits Singaporeans in so many ways because we are able to invest more in Singaporeans. We are able to provide them with more support. We are able to help them with so many different areas of life and ensure that everyone benefits from a higher standard of living.
I think the difference between PSP and PAP is that I think PSP prefers to put more money into the pocket of Singaporeans. Government can reduce some expenditures, but also reduce the taxes.
I would disagree with Mr. Leong's characterization of the PAP government's policy as refraining or denying Singaporeans from funding or keeping the funds and not leaving it in the pockets of Singaporeans, as he put it. That's not the case at all. Whatever we collect, we put it back to benefit Singapore and Singaporeans directly. That's what the budget is about. It's not about the government holding back something. It's about making sure that all that we collect goes back to Singaporeans in different ways. Some, of course, are direct transfers, but not all of it. After all, the PSP itself says that you shouldn't do so much because this will create entitlement.
Nominated MP Neil Parekh also rose to defend the government's fiscal policy. He says it has helped Singapore maintain high-quality credit ratings and attract investors.
I find it strange that we have spent all this time trying to defend a surplus while most developed economies in the world are begging for a surplus.